Welcome to The New Next, a podcast that addresses current events and how they will impact the future. Co-hosted by the inquisitive public speaking champion, Mike McVeigh, and energy, economics, and technology expert, Matt Jensen. Join us as we explore all things energy, economic, tech, and political, and how they will affect our future. So today, we're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject. And when I say everybody, I mean very few people. However, even though we've talked about this subject at least twice on our podcast, and Matt has done a very good job of educating me, I still don't have it on a back burner where I completely remember everything. And the reason why it's important is because in the past week, I've seen several articles, I've seen several news stories, even some memes about inflation. And it's not the first time we've had inflation, and I know we're going to go into kind of a deeper dive about inflation, but I heard on somebody's TV while passing in the hall this week, I want to say it was a politician, but they were talking about inflation. No, it wasn't a politician. That's what it was. They were talking about inflation, and they were talking about recession, and the way they talked about it seemed to differ from our previous talks. So Matt was like, "Hey, do you want to talk about solving the world's problems? Do you want to talk about, space travel, interdimensional travel, stuff like that?" I was like, "No, let's talk about inflation because, yeah." So some of this will be a little bit of a retread, but I promise you that it will definitely end up differently than our previous episodes because we have more information. And this is what we call a deep dive.
What, just right off the bat, do you remember anything in particular that you got from this news source that you thought was different than what we talked about?
The way the person was talking about it had something to do with either inflation feeding the recession or recession feeding the inflation. And I don't think this is what they said, but it might have been. It was something like to fight it, the only way that we can defeat inflation is to cause a recession, or it's the only way we can cause a recession is to defeat inflation, or like only way we can defeat the recession is to cause inflation. And I don't remember exactly what was said. That was problem was, like I said, I was walking down the hall, but it kind of irked me a little bit, and it didn't sound like Matt Jensen brilliance. It sounded like some kind of TV studio mumbo jumbo that was trying to fight for one side or the other. And honestly, I have no idea what station it was. It wasn't like a reporter or anything I recognize. So if what I said sounded correctly, it probably was not what was said.
Well, yeah, that's, I would say that that's kind of the common way of looking at it for people that don't really want to go too deep into how inflation's actually caused and kind of the situation that we're in right now.
And while we've had kind of this conversation back and forth, some of my friends have posted different memes, which I shared with you, and I know we're going to get to that later in this episode. And as much as I want to also talk about recession, which is everybody's second favorite topic after inflation, we will save that for a future deep dive because for those of you that just can't get enough, you'll have to wait another week, just like She-Hulk. Attorney at law. All right. So, Matt, what is inflation?
So inflation is generally thought of price increase in the goods and services that we buy. And from a fundamental sense, the metric of inflation that we all see and is talked about is basically a basket of goods. So they kind of created this list of things people normally buy. And like we said on a previous podcast, they have this whole team that goes out with iPads all across the nation and asks people how much goods and services are, or goes to the grocery store and plugs it in, cost rice and stuff like that, goes to the used car uh, dealers, ask them what they're selling certain cars for, etc. So it's kind of detailed, like there's a basket of goods, and that's changed multiple times since the last 40 years or so. But it's like we said before, in my opinion, there's better ways that you can do it with technology that are more accurate than basically having hundreds to thousands of people go around with iPads and basically plug in numbers. So it's yeah, it's that's kind of like the general idea of what inflation is. The Federal Reserve, who has typically kind of like their monetary power, um, and this is probably what they were talking about in that news story that you're referencing.
Mm-hmm.
They're able to raise and lower the Fed funds rate, which we can talk about later, um, in a method to essentially stimulate or decrease, increase or decrease interest rates, and therefore, you know, play with that whole demand metric that they have control over.
Uh, sorry, when you said the demand metric they had control over, I'm thinking of like, you will demand this now. Buy orange juice. Buy. And I'm like, man, I hate orange juice, but I feel like I'm really in a mood for orange juice. What's come over me? And then I drink orange juice and like, buy cinnamon rolls. Buy. This is what your demand is
Well,
for.
some some things like basically banks loan from the Federal Reserve
Mm-hmm.
through this discount window, and they're able to reloan that money. So when they get it for say 3% and loan it to their best customers out at like 5 or 6% um, for like houses, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
if they get it now for 5% and they loan it out for 7%, that basically decreases, that amount of house that certain people can afford, and how far their like monthly interest payments are on goods and services. So from a housing sense, the Fed has, I would say, a oversized factor in basically increasing or ratcheting down people's ability to afford more or less houses, like price wise.
Okay.
But it doesn't always work that way.
Well, how does inflation work exactly? How does it occur?
Well, we just kind of talked about like a demand driven inflation, where your cost money basically, that cost money allows you to afford more or less goods, and when there's more demand in the system, prices go up. So if you have, for instance, like a scenario that we've had basically since the 2000s, where interest rates have been super low compared to the 1980s, where interest rates were at 18% uh, for the federal funds rate, it totally changes the calculus of, um, you know, buying stuff like houses and stuff like that. So if I'm able to pay like $2,000 and afford a month on a mortgage and afford a $500,000 home, when that interest rate is basically allocated over 30 years and it goes way up, then maybe I can only afford a 350,000 or $400,000 home in that sense.
So how is this
So,
different from like just somebody deciding, "Ooh, I'm going to raise my prices," and it's so I find so like okay, this is something you and I have talked about specifically with me before we did this podcast, like finding ways to monetize something. So let's say I sell my service for $5, whatever that service is, and regardless of cost of anything else, I decide to double that to $10. How how is that inflation, or is that just me going like, wow, I really seriously devalued myself and I'm worth at least $10 instead of five?
well, I think in a in basically a kind of a perfect market, there supposedly comes to around kind of an equilibrium price. So with all else equal, if two people are selling the same goods
Hmm.
and one's at $10 and one's at $5, theoretically, um, from an economic sense, that would, people would buy the $5 stuff. We can go into consumer psychology, but if you know, there's a study that they did years ago and with wine, and they basically put the same exact wine in three glasses, and it basically said cheap, moderate, and expensive.
Right.
And people, you know, all thought that the expensive wine was by far the best. So in actuality, that doesn't necessarily hold true. But from a economic sense, you're making broad generalizations. So if you're going to look at like core commodities, there's kind of like two areas. We're just talking about houses, for instance. Houses are, I would say, kind of a commodity in certain ways because there's uh, generally a price per square foot if you've got similar homes like manufactured homes,
Right.
and and there's the demand stuff, but also inflation can be pushed up by supply stuff too, where there's just not enough supply and there's too many people that want to buy it. So there's the demand side where more people have more money and want to buy it. And then there's a supply side where like there's a supply shock where supply is taken out of the system, like we've had during COVID and stuff. So say that you have a huge a city that gets hit by a wildfire and 50% of their supply of homes get burned down. For then you're going to have a huge situation where there's supply constraints on it and people will pay a lot more. And, you know, through COVID, we really saw this a lot because kind of like the traditional supply chain
Hmm.
where it delivered goods very efficiently where the demand was, that broke down, and then all of a sudden you have people selling toilet paper for hundreds of dollars on eBay.
I guess what I'm, and maybe this is not an answerable question. That might be why it's bugging me so much. Like, at what point is it considered inflation as opposed to just a few people trying to be jerks to other people? Like, so one of the things that we've both had kind of the pleasure of having this summer is buying a car. And we've talked at links about some of my car stories of trying to find the right thing and everything. But so right now, like, obviously there's a supply and a demand issue with cars. Like, that's easy to say. Like, so in specifically in automobiles, there's inflation issues. Um, but when does it cross over to where we're just calling like, oh crap, there's inflation everywhere? It's not just because there's a shortage or a high demand, or is it always going to be? It's so they're like right now, uh, pens like PENS.
Yeah.
Right now, those prices, if anything, have gone down. Even though I don't think people have used pens less in the
Hmm.
past 2 years, but the prices have gone down generally speaking. So we wouldn't call that inflation, but envelopes,
You
paper.
call that deflation. So there's inflation and deflation.
Jerk.
Well,
Mike,
think
that's
think
deflation. It starts with a D.
yeah. Well, think about it like a balloon, right? You inflate a balloon or you deflate a balloon, and uh, I'd say inflation is kind of the change in price that's consistent.
Hmm.
So they measure this from a economy wide sense,
Okay.
and when it's there's I'd say supply shocks and demand shocks, but fundamentally on kind of like a rudimentary basis, it's a broad price increase or broad price decrease,
Okay. So
and that's what people really think about as inflation.
now, is it generally specific? And I know I'm kind of going over what you're saying, but I'm also trying to look at it from a little bit different. Like, so they go out with their iPads and stuff, and they're looking at certain items, but it is possible that an item that wasn't necessarily on their list all of a sudden kind of changes everything and forces. some of these other items, right? I mean, it's not necessary
Yeah.
because I don't think they go, or maybe now they do, but there probably wasn't 3 years ago. They weren't looking at the price of computers necessarily, but then the microchip becomes really difficult for a while. So all of a sudden, a $200 computer is $2,400. Um,
Yeah.
and you might get it before 2025 if you're lucky.
Huh.
We also call that the PS5, everybody. No.
Well, and you know, I think this is where we really see how energy prices have affected a lot of goods and services, because we've really built, especially in food, a global supply chain
Mhm.
where if you buy food locally from your local organic farmer, it's much more expensive. But if you're getting it from, you know, cheap labor in Chile or something like that, shipped halfway across the world, then it's at a lower price point. But with oil prices increasing, gasoline prices increasing, diesel prices increasing, especially in diesel's still over $5 a gallon.
Right,
So even though gas has gone down, diesel still that runs the show in terms of transportation.
right,
All that stuff, diesel especially, really feeds into food costs because we use it for tractors and you know,
right.
tractor trailers, move everything and stuff like that. So you know, I think, kind of to your point, energy costs have been a big driver of price increases, but also stuff that comes from hydrocarbons, like fertilizer, for instance. Uh, with the whole Russia Ukraine stuff, we basically outlawed buying fertilizer in the
Oh,
U.S.
really?
Eh, yeah, well, from Russia.
Oh,
Russia's
okay. It's like,
yeah,
wow. Sorry, guys, you can't grow your
but
crops.
I think we're getting like 40% of our nitrogen based fertilizer from Russia.
Okay.
So you know, stuff like that basically dramatically increases um, the cost of doing things. And sometimes people switch from maybe growing corn to soybeans, for instance, and they kind of switch their fields out. But it's, yeah, we live in an interconnected economy. And when the feedstocks that basically help us produce these goods go way up, then you know that's typically called like cost push inflation, and that's where like producer costs um, increase, so they basically pass those costs onto their consumers. And then there's also, you know, generally supply issues. So
Right,
with like used cars, you're saying, you're referencing like the lack of supply on there allows basically the end sellers of these cars to add a market adjustment on it, where they may, and I don't know for this for a fact, but I've thought a lot about this, is on a typical car sale, they may make like, you know, $2,000 to $3,000, something not that much. And if they're adding $5,000 or $10,000 on top of all these prices, like Ford doesn't get anything of that.
hmm,
So they're not making as much money, but the actual end dealers are probably making as much profit or more profit than they were before at a much lower transaction volume, because they've, you know,
yeah.
you have that imbalance between supply and demand. So
Well, then you also, yeah,
inflation,
yeah,
yeah, inflation really occurs when you have that supply demand imbalance. There's too much supply, or there's too much demand, or there's not enough supply, and kind of relates to shocks around that.
yeah. And then you add in the whole financing, especially if you do it through the dealership and stuff, and
Yeah.
they definitely make bank on that. So,
Well, like just real quick, another good example for they when Obama was president, they did a cash for clunkers
mhm,
program, which was a one-time, basically, um, like stimulus handout. I don't know what you'd call it. That if you turn in an old car, they would give you money to essentially buy a new or newer used car. And that was something where it basically stimulated demand, because it's like, here's extra money to go buy this car. And I think that was after the financial crisis. So um, there's a lot of the government uses a lot of subsidies, and we've talked about that in like renewable energy,
Right.
but and EVs, but uh, like they recently passed a EV tax credit, and ironically, a lot of the companies are raising the prices by that same amount. So
Yeah, which defeats pretty much the purpose of um and
there's
that's a whole other thing.
there's a lot of demand.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Matt, I'm just going to say it on the air, and you're edit this out if you don't want it. So at some point, we need to talk about like just companies in general and their pricing strategies. I know that's not necessary. I guess it's not energy related, but it is finance related, and like the ethics of price gouging, and what's considered price gouging and what's not. Like what's legitimate. But we have to talk about that sometime
Mhm.
because I think it would be really interesting, especially with energy rates having gone up a couple times before the pandemic, and then of course during the pandemic as well. Now you have given some examples like about oil and natural gas specifically with inflation, but is this a common for all the energy markets in general, or is this really kind of limited to those two markets?
Well, there's yes. So there's a lot of demand. There's been a lot of demand for energy, and with that too, like China, for instance, is going through China and Western U.S. and Europe are going through drought situations where their river levels and lake levels just aren't where
Mhm.
they are. So you've seen areas in both the U.S. and especially in China. China's recently, uh, I think, Sichuan province, which has primarily uses hydropower. They're basically telling companies to shut down, like not use electricity, so they have enough for certain people. Europe too, like Gazprom just shut off. They found a leak in their oil pipeline, or they're doing um, doing maintenance on that. So I th- I think European energy prices are up 1,000% year over year. So we have it a lot better here, but still natural gas here has been more expensive than it has been in years,
Right.
and um, a big reason of that is we're shipping off a lot more overseas than we did before, and there's also basically pretty excessive demand for um, everything: oil, natural gas, coal. Um, when you have like so hydropower is pretty efficient. There's granted a lot of the uh, hydropower facilities in the world are extremely old,
Hmm.
but basically it uses the weight of water to turn turbines and generate electricity. But that stuff is relatively cheap and has been working for 60 years. But if the water's not there, then you're kind of out of luck. And
Right.
like we've talked about with Germany too, especially last year they had a lack of wind, so their wind power was way down.
Hmm.
There's just not enough generation in the world, and we talked a little bit about nuclear too. um, Nuclear is it's easier to, I'd say, since it's so energy dense with uranium,
Hmm.
it's easier to um, kind of ratchet that a little bit. So if it's not there, it's not there. And generally we live in a free market. uh, coal coal production, I think, was the record last year. Coal consumption, which the irony, right? You try to switch all to renewables, and the thing that you want to kill is going
Worse.
bonkers.
Yeah.
But yeah. So
Okay.
hopefully that kind of generally answers your question.
Very generally, it's almost a good thing I asked a general question instead of a specific question. Though I will ask a more specific question. You did mention shocking the market a little bit earlier, and maybe this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in the ethics of um, pricing. But I'm sure there are some situations where some companies or um, governments or something are using artificial shocks to basically, uh, or maybe even essentially, keep markets high. Would that be a correct assumption? And if so, could you give a couple examples?
Well, so there are price gouging laws in the US, and that's basically like if you have a natural disaster or something, you're not able to charge $50 for a gallon of milk, for instance. But there are, probably a good example is the Oklahoma Texas freeze that we had a couple years ago. So you had a perfect storm, right? Um, Wind power,
Oh
which is
yeah,
makes
yeah,
it
yeah.
makes a huge percentage of both Oklahoma and Texas. Those turbines weren't winterized. You had a lot of wells basically freeze up and stop producing. So you had a lack of natural gas and uh, flowing from the wells and making it to the generation facilities. And there wasn't enough storage capacity on site for a lot of natural gas. So, um, people have tried to say one side is evil and the other side's evil, for the last couple of years. But the fact of the matter is everything kind of failed. And um, there's been uh, adjustments since then. But at least in Oklahoma, here during that pretty extreme freeze that we had, where it was 20 below or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
they had to go to the corporation commission to basically get um, approval to essentially, so the utilities are highly regulated, right? So they had to go to the corporation commission to get an agreement to essentially allow that cost that they incurred for, like, for us, it would have been thousands of dollars for our heating bill, right? To be basically allocated over 10 years.
Hmm.
In Texas, there's one company in particular that I knew of that I don't remember the name of, but they have a pricing structure which is really kind of unregulated, where the people basically pay a kind of a base fee, and then they pass all the natural gas cost onto the consumers. So there were I read a couple stories about people, you have to have your bank account, attached to it too, that basically got like $10,000 deducted from their bank account because they basically pass it on, and there's not sort of a kind of a structured rate fee on there.
Right.
So I think that's just I don't know if it's necessarily price gouging, but I think um, there's laws with like gasoline, for instance, after Katrina and stuff like that, against um, charging excessive rates.
Right. Well, I remember specifically with Katrina that President Bush actually put a hold on, like, he put a freeze on how much prices could go up for gasoline and stuff. And what's funny is I think that was about 30 or 40 cents less than what we're currently paying for gas, at least here in Oklahoma City. Um,
Yeah.
um, but there are, I mean, there are companies or um, markets that do have artificial shocks, right? That, I mean, I know we're talking like specifically like price gouging, but there's other ones that are situations where artificial shocks are kind of put out there.
Yeah. So, well, I guess the oil market is a good example.
Yeah, but we already talked about
Oh,
that. Pick a different one.
yeah. Well, but just, OPEC is a controls the organization for petroleum exporting countries. They're the basically, I'd say, the undemocratic countries of the world, like Russia, Saudi Arabia, stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They have a cartel, which, if it was a U.S. based cartel, would be illegal and be able to be broken up by our monopoly laws. They control 90% of the world's supply. So they're able to ratchet it up and down, and really influence the price of oil when it's traded across the world. De Beers with diamonds. So De Beers,
Not De Beers.
they control most of the world's diamond trade, and they're really smart, I guess, about keeping that price high by not over flooding the market, and also
Yeah.
luxury goods.
Well,
So
before you go into that one, which I still find completely humor or lots of humor in the fact that diamonds are valuable. And I mean,
you know,
I guess that's one way to really make the market believe something of a, yeah, I'm going to start selling magma.
well, they have a lot of value for their kind of commercial applications too,
Oh,
and tooling and stuff
I
like
know,
that.
but
But
still,
yeah,
go on, go on.
yeah, no, I know. But when you get married, your wife wants one, so
Thankfully, my wife was very frugal, and we've probably the 3 wedding rings that we've had to have like either repaired or readjusted or whatever when we both lost ours still cost less than what most people spend on one.
wow, yeah,
Yeah, so take that world. Mm,
yeah, mine wasn't cheap. Well, my one for myself is very inexpensive,
yeah,
but
I think
um
my wife's engaged only because we're talking about diamonds. We might as well go into this, and I don't think she'll get upset at me, but I think her engagement ring was $299
oh sweet.
and 99 cents at Walmart. Um, but we picked out the one that she wanted. In fact, I was kind of like, no, no, I have to get you a bigger one because I need everybody to know that I love you. I don't just not,
Uh,
love you like all those other wimps or people that don't have money like me. And she's like, no, this is the one I want. And yeah,
it's
silly women.
it's different outside the US.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. But all right, go ahead. Luxury goods.
well, I was,
Oh, yeah, please.
you know, granted, luxury goods don't have necessarily the branding of diamonds,
Mm-hmm.
but Chanel is a good example. If they come out with certain stuff, they offer retail stores, so they may put basically send like a quantity of two for a certain product to a store to make sure that not everybody in your area is going to have one, and it creates kind of this artificial, I would say, supply constraint where they're able to not dilute their brand and keep that supply low and charge a higher price. But
Co-
it's pretty genius.
Coach is a big brand too, right? Or luxury brand.
Yeah.
I'm honestly convinced that the reason why Coach is like popular is because they're really leaning into the demographic of guys who are sports fans who have girlfriends, and so they feel less bad about buying a bag named with the brand Coach than Chanel or whatever. I don't know all the luxury stuff. Thankfully, my wife is her luxury is like buying the new expansion pack for Final Fantasy, but
That's
um,
hilarious.
but I mean, honestly, even seeing a Coach store, like I could see a guy like myself going, like, "Oh, a store about coaching, sure." And they're like, "Oh, purses. Well, I mean, I guess I could buy my wife a purse. Oh, it's $5 million, and well,
Birkin bags.
but then my wife doesn't really watch sports. In fact, she always like, "Hey, which sports team is winning? Is it the sports team with the ball or the other sports team?" And I'm like, "Hey, if I get her a Coach bag, then now she'll be able to say that she has something sportsy." I'm not even making a joke. I honestly do believe that that's one reason why Coach in particular is a luxury brand. I'm weird, so I don't care. And everybody's like, okay, and this is when we turn turn off the podcast and listen to silence.
Don't give them any ideas.
No, in fact, you should rate this episode along with all of our other episodes either 4 or 5 stars, because sometimes we only give a 4 star
Five
performance.
stars.
Okay, 5 star performance. But you know what? I'm more of a guy of letting you pick what you want, and that's why we're going to ask Matt this next question, which um, is why you listen to this podcast. So we recently heard that the Federal Reserve was going to raise rates to tackle inflation, and what role exactly does the Federal Reserve play in affecting inflation? And hold on, if you want to hear this answer, give us 5 stars. All right, go ahead, Matt.
So, like we said before, the Federal Reserve loans out money to primary dealers. That it's basically a selection of banks that have the ability to loan money from the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve itself kind of has some sort of targets that they try to reach, which is historically a dual target. So full unemployment and inflation rate of 2%. Uh, Having an inflation rate of 2%, they try to basically ensure that goods that you buy today from a producer isn't worth less tomorrow, unless there's technological changes
You
there.
guys gonna say like unless
Um,
it's a car or a computer?
yeah. And then in recent years, stable asset prices or inflated asset prices has probably been almost a third mandate there for a long time. If you saw basically a trade down in the stock market pretty steep, you'd see the Federal Reserve basically kick down rates.
Hmm.
So it just goes to show you how much margin is in the financial markets. But
Yeah. Um,
so
why would?
so
Oh, go ahead.
well, like you're asking why they'd be raising rates to target inflation,
Hmm.
and that's basically to try to lower demand and you know
I need a
put
car.
people out of
Hey, we're just gonna raise the price $10,000.
yeah,
Now I don't need a car.
or you buy something cheaper, right?
And speaking of cars, so I had to wait a little bit to buy tags, and I bought tags separate. I didn't realize there was such a thing as that the dealership could buy the tags for you or something, and it hurt. It hurt bad. Thankfully, payday came like on the exact same day, and so Brenda and I will probably eat ramen noodles for the next month.
It was like 2 grand.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just a little under, and I was literally going in prepared to pay like 300, maybe $500, and they told me next year that, and this is with using my same old license plate. So next year they said like, yeah, it's probably going to be around $150, and I'm just like, this is one reason why if a person tries to upsell you on your car, don't do it unless you actually want that stuff, because that increases how much you pay on your tags, title, and tax.
yeah.
People, so if you
Tax and title, man.
cup holders are not that worthy, those stupid
Hmm.
mats, don't buy them because they raise your rate on that. Just saying. So why would the Fed want inflation? I'm sorry, it's a really bad non sequitur, transition, but I'm still kind of upset about stupid floor mats that I didn't get a choice on.
Hmm. Well, so the Fed wants inflation to basically keep uh, prices from uh, deflating and having a lot of people be stuck with goods that are worth less money. And another, like, I mean, nobody's really talked about this, but one way to get out of the debt that we're in right now is to artificially stimulate inflation and make the dollar less valuable. So um, that's yeah, that's another story for another day.
Yeah, when we get near the end of this, I have a question that I'm curious on your answer to. But I already kind of know this answer, but it's probably important for the two viewer listeners. How have the changes in rates at the Fed affected the housing market?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about that earlier. The Federal Reserve sets rates, and that basically uh, allows banks to loan from them, and then banks will loan based on your kind of credit rating,
Mm-hmm.
uh, a multiple of that based on your risk profile. So if it's kind of like if you came to me and were like, I want to borrow $1,000 because I can loan it out to someone else, I'd be like, well, I mean, maybe I charge you 5%, right,
Mm-hmm.
on that annually, and you're able to loan it out at 7 or 10%. That's where banks make their money, is by essentially distributing the Fed's money throughout the system, and kind of keeping that whole money rate uh, economy flowing. So um, when rates get higher, since you're essentially, when you buy a house, like the bank will own that house, even though you live on a pay money every single month.
Mm-hmm.
When your your monthly payment is essentially allocation of both the principal of that house, but also the amount of interest that you're going to pay over the life of that note. So when that interest goes up, it essentially makes your house more expensive. So if I, have a budget of $2,000 or $4,000 a month to buy a house, and the interest rate goes up a lot, then um, it essentially allows me to afford less principal over that life of the loan because I'm paying more in interest,
Right.
and that has a deflationary effect on housing prices typically.
Yeah.
But we're at a supply we're undersupplied on single family homes by 4 or 5 million in the U.S. So you both have a supply problem in a lot of major cities like Seattle, where I'm from, and San Francisco and stuff like that, for affordable homes.
How
And then there's also kind of the interest rate effects on that too.
how much of that has to do with people trying to flip homes? Is it
Well,
like, I don't know what the percentage is, but maybe you know offhand. I know this isn't in our talking points and stuff, but like, I hear a lot of people that have one of their houses owned or whatever, that they go and buy another house for the purpose of flipping it. And is that an actual problem right now, or is it just I mean, it's a problem, but not really to the extent of that it's causing housing deficiencies.
I'd say more short term rentals, since those kind of replace typically what you've historically had
Mm.
hotels in that area. I think that there's like 4 million short term rentals in the U.S.,
Oh
and those
wow.
are single family homes. So I would say that I think that's more of a cause of a lack of capacity or lack of supply affecting the price. But also on the demand side too, you've had uh, a bunch of huge private equity funds get into this market, to basically buy up houses and resell them, or rent them out for a rental portfolio
Hmm.
in the last 10, 15 years, like massive funds. So there's been a lot of criticism for that too, because they use money from savings from funds, LPs in there, to basically go out and um, pay cash for stuff,
Right.
and are also able to pay out more money because they're getting a rental rate on top of that. And there's been some funds too that have done that for short-term rentals also. So it's I I think I don't really know. I haven't done the research on flipping. I have done it on the other stuff, the kind of the math behind it and the economics.
Hmm.
But I would say flipping is less of concern. Oftentimes, those houses, like their whole goal is to get them back on the market, so a single family person can buy it, and they add a lot of value in there by making it nicer, making it up to standard quality, you know,
Gotcha.
for what people have the expectation on it. So I feel that they're building value in it
Okay.
for the consumer. And
Yeah, I didn't even know
yeah,
about the 4 million people for short-term leases and stuff. So yeah, that
yeah, it's
definitely is.
extremely
So
profitable.
even if flipping was a problem, that's not anywhere comparable. If you would like to learn more about the New Next podcast, find us at thenewnextpodcast.com, where you can suggest a topic you would like for us to cover. If you enjoyed what you heard, share the podcast, tell a friend about it, or rate us with 5 stars.